good? I'm good. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. All right. It is Monday, but I need to hear a little bit more response from you all. Welcome to the Institute on the Environment and the third installation of our Making Change Sustainability and Organization series. We're really excited to have Amy Skoczlas here this morning. I'm Jeff Standish, the manager of corporate sustainability here at the Institute on the Environment, and wanted to welcome you all here. Some of you, you've been here for past speakers. Some of you may be your first time. If it is your first time, just want to let you know there's obviously plenty of coffee and donuts in the back. The restrooms are out to the atrium and to the right. Always important to make that common knowledge. The other thing, housekeeping item, is we are live streaming with our colleagues in Duluth. Dustin's making funny faces, so I'll make funny faces back. So we'll be using microphones so that they have quality audio up there. I just want to say a couple quick words before I introduce my colleague here, Tim Smith. But what I want to say is the Institute on the Environment is a pretty unique place here at the University of Minnesota. We work across disciplines and across sectors to fulfill our mission around prospering people and planet for the future. Gatherings like this series, are illustrative of how we try to accomplish that work. This speaker series is one way that we try to drive impact forward, and it's a really important aspect to include students like yourselves, the majority audience here today. You are our emerging leaders going forward into the future. I'll leave it there, and at this point, I'll turn it over to Tim Smith, who's a faculty member, as most of you all know, because you're in one of his classes of some sort, in bioproducts, biosystems engineering. Tim, take it away.
Great. Thanks. I think there's some folks from the Carlson School here, too, where I also teach. But no, thank you all for making time to be here. I know that there are others in the room besides students, so also please make sure that you pipe up with lots of questions and keep us moving. This is part of a speaker series that we have put together for the first time this year. And so we're super excited to have Amy here as part of that. I do want to make a quick announcement that tomorrow at 4 p.m. is the next in that series. Chris Clark, who's the president of Minnesota and the Dakotas for Xcel Energy, will be here at 4 o'clock tomorrow. And again, check the events page of IonE for the others later in the semester. So without any further ado, I do want to try to do my best to introduce Amy. I've known Amy for at least maybe 7 or 8 or 9 years, I don't know. But she's had her hands in so many different pies that it's going to be very difficult to sort of give her background justice. But she currently leads the water main project at American Public Media Group, which is a really cool new initiative to try to figure out how to create communication platforms and relationships across the public sphere, as well as just people, to try to understand this really complex and interesting topic of water. Before that, though, she spent time running sustainability programs and foundation programs at companies like Pentair and eBay. Before that, has a huge amount of experience in the nonprofit sector with Conservation International. So anyways, I'm sure I'm missing 1,000 things, but with that, I'll leave it with Amy, and thank you again for being here.
There's these comfy chairs, and it seems kind of insane for a Monday morning not to take you guys up on one of them, and then I can see better. So I'm going to sit, as weird as that seems. I've never sat to talk, but this is actually quite cozy. Are you jealous? And that way I can drop this. So thanks, it's super fun to be here. I love the Institute on the Environment. In fact, I moved to Minnesota about 8 years ago almost. And Institute on the Environment was one of 2 organizations in the state of Minnesota that made me feel like home. I moved from the Bay Area, from California, as Tim said, had been doing corporate sustainability work for about 15, 18 years by then. And when my husband got his dream job in Minnesota, and I kind of looked at a map and was like, where are we again? Is it a square state? Geography was not one of my specialties, at least not in the United States. So when we moved here, and I found 3 phenomenal organizations and communities that made me feel like I was at home. I'm pretty sure Institute on the Environment was the first one, right? It was the North Star Initiative where I met Tim and Jennifer and a whole bunch of folks here, and so that was one place. The corporate sustainability community actually was really a great welcoming home when I got here. And then the third was Minnesota Public Radio, and so, which is where I work now. So it is super fun to be here. I'm going to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes, I'm just writing what time that clock says, which is totally fake news over there, y'all. It's 10:40 apparently. So I'm going to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes talking about my experience, so about 25 plus years as a change maker for the environment. And that is the through line to my career. And since I'm going to talk about what I've learned, it probably does make sense for me to just spend a few minutes so that you know kind of where I've been and where I'm talking from. So probably just in terms of connecting, in terms of values, I guess I'll start in the 2nd grade. In the 2nd grade, I wrote a report, a passionate call to action about how to save the endangered koala bears. And let me tell you, I got myself quite worked up about this. Had pictures cut out of magazines and the whole 9 yards that you do in 2nd grade. Now, koala bears are not and have never been listed as an endangered species on the Endangered Species Act, but my heart was very, very much in the right place. And I think that sort of tells you from where I came into this work. I got an undergrad degree in environmental policy, a grad degree in business before there was a specialty in the environment, and started my career at Conservation International. And at Conservation International, I was part of an early team of folks that was actually thinking about how do we work with business and economics and markets and use those as levers for change to benefit sustainable development and the environment around the world. I've worked on every continent but Antarctica, and have worked with some of the biggest businesses around in that time. If you look on the bag of Starbucks coffee these days, you'll see a Conservation International logo, and it was the work that I led that put it there. I guess the thing to know from all of that was pretty revolutionary at that time. In fact, my boss and I, who helped start the Center of Excellence at Conservation International, we got kicked out of the environmentalist happy hour in Washington, D.C. when they learned that we were doing this. So that lever for change has been one that I think those of us that care about the environment have been working on for any number of years. And after that, I decided that it wasn't enough just to be on the outside looking in and telling big companies what to do. I felt like in the 13 years that I was at CI, they had made tremendous progress. There was no such thing as a sustainability officer when I started working with these businesses. There was an environment or health and safety officer, and then they added in environment afterwards. So this is a little history lesson for all y'all. But so from there, though, businesses got smart fast, way faster, I would say, than those of us in the environmental community did. And so I decided that it was important to be from within the walls of company. And so I joined eBay as their first chief sustainability officer, and my job was mitigating their footprint related to the environmental impacts of running data centers all around the world, as well as commerce, e-commerce, but also to figure out where we had some competitive advantage, and I'll talk about that. And then when we moved here, I joined Pentair, which is a water technology company, and I was their first vice president for sustainability, and I led their foundation for a couple of years. And then most recently, as Tim said, I joined American Public Media, which those of us in Minnesota know as Minnesota Public Radio. And I lead a new initiative called the Water Main, which is about creating public will for clean, accessible, affordable water. And that topic, public will, and I think, I don't know if it got advertised as this, but to me, what I'm going to talk about is public will for the public commons. Because I think what we all have in common here is an interest in how the public commons are managed. Let me just see by a show of hands, how many of you all are undergrads? Okay, most of the room. And are you in the engineering school? Natural sciences? Business? Business? What did I miss? Not a lot of engineers, few natural sciences, some business. What else? Yell out what you're... What else are you guys studying? Don't know? You just thought it would be fun on a Monday morning to come sit and hear me talk?
I think we covered most of it.
Everything, yeah.
The natural resources.
Natural
A
resources.
bunch of different
Okay.
names, so they probably are affiliated with different names.
Got it.
Sustainable systems management.
Sustainability as a trend? Yeah. Okay. So what do I have to offer for your Monday morning here? So I'm not a scientist, right? And I'm not actually a trained journalist or a trained communicator, but I have spent the last 25 years actually trying to think about how we make change at scale. Every piece of my career has been about finding that leverage point. And I am at a point in my career in which I feel like we as a community have done an amazing job as finding lever points, but we have forgotten to build our foundation. And so that's actually why I want to take the time to be here today, is to actually reinforce how important I think that foundation is. And let me give you a case in point. So when I took over and started the water main at Minnesota Public Radio, we did some social science research to understand what Minnesotans already knew and understood about water. So how many of you are from Minnesota originally? Okay. How many of you would say that water is kind of a big deal in our state? Yeah? Right? Kind of part of who we are. All right. So here's some data for you. So this survey was conducted in 2016. It was both NPR listeners and non-listeners, and it was statewide. And in 2016, only 15% of Minnesotans believed that we have water problems in the state of Minnesota. In fact, most Minnesotans, 57%, believed that water here is good or excellent. How many of you all know that 40% of Minnesota's water is impaired, meaning it's not safe for swimming, drinking, fishing? Some of you. Well, that's a fact. 40% of our water is here. 80% of Minnesotans said that we have water problems elsewhere. But that's not true. We have water problems right here in the state of Minnesota. And I can tell you that our major communications outlets, whether it's Minnesota Public Radio, or whether it's the Star Tribune, or whether it's WCCO, all of our major communications outlets, including the university, have focused on the fact that water is at risk in Minnesota. So, and have done that for well over a decade, and have done it with skill. So what does that tell me? What that tells me is that information alone isn't sufficient to actually change people's hearts and minds and understanding of things, right? So let's talk a little bit about what is important, right? What does public will require? So this is based on my experience. It's also based on social science data. The first is that people understand an issue. So what a university does in terms of creating massive amounts of information is really, really critical. But then that university also has to take that information and make it such that people can understand, and there's a big gap between having the information and understanding it. And then more importantly, and this is where we get into some really interesting territory, whether you're in corporate sustainability or natural resource management, you also have to have people that care about an issue, right? It's those two things, knowing, understanding, and caring, that together create public will. So what are we talking about when we talk about public will? Public will, by definition, leads to new, enduring societal expectations. And those new changes in societal expectations, we could call them societal norms, shape the way that people act and think and behave. And the vast majority of what we do as a society is based on these societal norms, is based on these societal expectations. So I think that there is a formula lucky for all of us. I think there's a formula for creating public will. And I think that there are 4 steps that when we take them together, and we put them together with really important facts and information and data, will actually start to create change in a form societally, you might call it viral, right, for this generation, that where the change actually starts to take on a life of its own, which is kind of what we're all about, whether we're sitting inside of a company or we're sitting inside of a nonprofit or we're sitting inside of a media organization. So those 4 steps to me are things that we can do, right? I'm not big on thinking about what other people need to do. I'm really big on thinking about what we need to do. So be curious, be human, know your value, and show what's possible. This is my 4-step formula to creating public will. So let me start with the first one, curiosity. It's maybe a strange place to start, but if you're here in a center of learning, hopefully this is a skill that you have some insight into. And when you think about your life, and you think about the people that you care about, aren't you curious about their lives? Like when you get home to a significant other, or to a parent or a roommate, aren't you like, hey, how was your day? What'd you do today? Don't you ask questions? You ask questions. You're not like, hey, we got a water problem. You're like, hey, how was your day? Hey, was your parking space taken today? Hey, did you clean out the fridge like you told me you were gonna? Like, we use the form of inquiry as curiosity as a way of building connection and of making things happen. And that is kind of the key to it, is it takes connection to be able to communicate, right? And it takes curiosity to build connection. So curiosity, all great influence starts with curiosity. And so, again, curiosity leads to connection. Once you have a connection with people, you have a connection with your professors, right? You have a connection with your professors such that you have some connection that leads you to believe and be interested in what they have to say. I bet there's probably, if university is anything like it was 25 years ago, there's probably a professor or two you don't have a connection with, and you will experience that over the course of your university career. And I bet that professor is going to be way less effective at communicating with you, right? It's that connection that's going to get you thinking and engaged in what that person is talking about. So let me give an example from the world of 2 worlds of public media. The first is a campaign that if you haven't seen it, you should look it up. It's called I See Change, I-S-E-E Change. So this was an engagement campaign that was started out of Colorado Public Radio, and then got a bunch of Western public radio stations engaged, including Southern California Public Radio, which is part of American Public Media, which is how I know about it, but in any case. The idea was that it is crowdsourcing how people are seeing change in their communities related to nature, environment, and climate, right? So, how do we start tackling the thorny issue of people actually not believing in climate change? Well, one of the ways that we do it is by observing climate change, right? And so this does that at scale. It gathers communities' observations of changes in plants, changes in butterflies, changes in birds, changes in rainfall, changes in whatever. And then it has engaged scientists to be part of the discussion with those people making those observations, just normal people, right, without any scientific training, to help say, like, this is what you're observing, this is what you're seeing. So the scientist plays the sense-making role, but the community member is the person making the observation. It's your neighbor, right? Your neighbor that you're much more likely to believe than someone kind of is sitting in an ivory tower far away. The founder of this effort, it's been going on since 2012, still going strong, said that she was really curious about what it takes to engage people in climate change in a collaborative way, right? And that's what this has been an experience in. As I'm building the water main program, I have that same level of curiosity. And so we've actually just released, well, actually, we'll formally release it next week, but you could find it if you Googled, the research around we want to know how Americans actually relate to water. We don't want to presume that just because we think water is important, that you think water is important, or just because I think that, you know, the fact that we need $1 trillion in new infrastructure in water to keep kind of the water service that we have, that that's something that you find important, even though I find that terrifyingly important. And so we've done this research that went out and said, tell us how you think about this topic area. Tell us where you find it to be relevant in your life. And that's because we're really building our program around 2 key points of change, and it goes back to the understanding and the caring. And so one, we want to understand what people understand about water challenges, and we call that water IQ, because of course we need a cute little handle for it, right? And then the second is we want to know how much people care about it, and so we call that water EQ. How relevant is it in your life? And these are data points that we'll be able to track over time to see how effective our program has been. And what our data found with this, one of the really cool things that about working in American public media is I have in-house researchers, and they sit right next door to me. It's like really fun. If I buy them coffee, they go out and do surveys. It's super cool. It's kind of a data geek's like dream. And so they went out and they did this survey. And one of the things that we found was, you know, how do people think water shows up in their daily lives? Well, one way they think it shows up is in their health and their well-being. So that one did not surprise me. But another way that we see that it shows up is through food, and that one did surprise me. And in fact, people showed as strong a correlation between how they thought about water and food as they did about water and health. And so that was really interesting to me because I feel like we have talked about water and health as a community. We really have not talked much about water and food in that way, in ways that are designed to drive better understanding and engagement around water. And so, and when people talked about it, right, you have to take the data at face value. You know, it was everything from, yes, I understand that it takes a tremendous amount of water to grow our produce, and that water can become heavily polluted, and that impacts, you know, people's drinking water. Some segments got that. Other people said they needed it to cook mac and cheese. Both are really valid, right? And both are really important. And it's really important to be curious about where people are starting. Because if I started to talk about water and food and it was only about agricultural pollution, I'd miss like half my audience, right? And this is no different than the kind of thought process that I went through when I was leading sustainability for big companies. When I started at eBay, it was 2008. Does anybody remember what happened in 2008? There was this tiny little recession, right? And started in Silicon Valley, where eBay was. And so I started at the very worst time you could imagine starting a corporate sustainability job at a Silicon Valley-based company. But what did I start doing? I went around the company and I said, tell me what your big problems are, and tell me what you care about. Tell me what you think we need to do to win. I didn't start by saying, oh my God, our data centers are going to be based in a state that is 98% coal powered and therefore are going to have a greenhouse gas footprint 5 times what it is in California. That was true. That was true, and that was important, and I had to get there. But I also had to know where I was starting and where people were thinking. So that leads to my second point, be human. And I feel like I have to say that anytime I come into a university setting in which I might be communicating with scientists. Scientists who are among my favorite people, but who make this mistake that people want communicated to the same way that you want communicated to. And let me tell you, your brains just work differently if you're a scientist, right? And that's great. It takes all types. But this is one place where we cannot follow the golden rule, right? Like, don't assume that you are the audience. Don't do what you want for you. If you want data in charts and tables, understand that that is not how most people process information. So start where your audience is. De-jargon everything that you have to say. Again, this is corporate sustainability, media, nonprofit science communication. Holds true for all of it, right? Ditch the jargon. If you can't say it so that you're explaining it to your 75-year-old mother, try again. because everything that we're doing can be explained in that way. And in fact, the most effective science communicators are the ones that can distill it down to the simplest messages. And then tell a story. The power of story just cannot be underestimated. So there's research out of this. Here, so I'm going to go to the data. Right? So here's the data. University of Wisconsin-Madison has done a lot of really good research into how people process information. And what they found is that when you give people the same information in a narrative form, like a story, they absorb it twice as fast, and they recall it twice. They're twice as likely to recall it. And that doesn't matter what the subject is. This can be highly technical information. But if you understand basic brain science and how we process information, you understand that anytime you're trying to get information to people in ways that you can influence them, that first, you have to capture their interest. And second, they have to devote time and attention to it. And third, they have to think about it. That's the processing, right? And then they have to recall it. They have to remember it. Story, narrative, helps with all four of those essential steps in helping people get data, package that data in a way that it can be stored in their brains and remembered. So again, going back to the example of water, you know, in the most recent, I think it's the most recent Gallup Environment poll, 85% of Americans said that they're concerned about water pollution. It was the top most concerning environmental topic of any surveyed by the Gallup poll. And I'm gonna space the name of the university. I wish I had written it down, but you can Google it. It's a university that does fears. What fears do Americans have? Interesting time to be coming up with that data. It came out, I think, last week. So the top fear actually was corruption of government officials, which I thought was really fascinating for its own right. But the second top fear and the third top fear both related to water. And I can't remember which was which, but one was about pollution of our drinking water and one was about pollution of our lakes, rivers, oceans, streams, etc. So water is this great topic that allows me to start with where people are, right? With that being human and starting with where people's brains already are as they relate to the environment. And that's why we picked it, frankly. You know, the topic originally for our initiative at American Public Media was sustainability. And hey, I love sustainability as much as all of you all. Sustainability to me is the process and the systems of making change, right? You know what? That's not actually what most people really care about. What they really care about is the thing that you are helping to steward, the thing that you are helping to change, the thing that you are helping to protect, which is why we took our sustainability initiative and pointed it at water. And by the way, water is a gateway into every other environmental issue that you care about. I have this great partnership with ClimateCast, which is NPR's climate show, and we talk about how climate change shows up in Minnesota through water. Too much in the wrong season, in the wrong place, not frozen when we want it to be. It is a gateway into social equity, and the fact that despite the fact that many of us may feel like, you know, up north cabin culture, water is the way that Minnesota has evolved, that's not the experience for our Native Nations folks. That's not the experience for people who are new Americans, and that's certainly not the experience for folks living in urban centers that have been cut off and removed from access to water by design. So I give that example to show you can start with where you found curiosity and where you find your audience and layer to any issue that you feel like people need to be engaged in. My third point was be valuable. And specifically, that means knowing how you can help the people that you're trying to engage, that you're trying to change, that you're trying to influence, that you're trying to communicate with. So let's start with, do I say this? Let's start with the kind of, I think, dirty little secret of the sustainability community. And that is, all of us are pretty much true believers, right? I bet a lot of you have stories like my koala bear story, right? You really passionately believe that this is the right thing to do for society. And that true north value guides you. And that's really important. But if we insist that everyone start with that true north kind of value, we're going to lose big swaths of our people that we want to influence along the way. And again, doesn't matter whether you're trying to influence public policy, or you're trying to change the direction that a company is taking, or whether you're trying to change the way that society is viewing an issue. We have to know how people process change as it relates to their self-interest. And I do not mean narrow self-interest, right? I mean self-interest most broadly. So you guys probably know Institute on the Environment is one of the homes to the Natural Capital Project, which is one of my personal favorite environmental programs here. It shocked me, and then it didn't shock me when the Natural Capital Project started thinking about how to put financial numbers to the many, many, many benefits that ecosystems provide to us, so that people making decisions, whether you're a company or a government or a community, could make better decisions, so that we can take the priceless and help understand that value. Oh my goodness, was there this huge backlash, at least in like the peer-reviewed journal world, of how that was kind of trampling the sacred. But what I think that conversation missed was, we have to understand that people have value sets in different places. And that's the hardest thing that we're going to tackle right here, right this, is figuring out where other people's values lie and meeting them where they are with that. Your worldview, how you see yourself and your community in the world, impacts every decision that you make. And we have seen, we only have to look at American politics today to understand that data and facts and analysis and science are powerless when stacked up against our brains' need to filter, segment, and process information. So what does that mean? What do we do, right? Do we just give up and go home? No, we again have to think about how we can use the best information, the best science that we know how. So we've been curious, right? And we've gotten really human, and we've shed that armor of like, here's how scientists talk, so I'm going to talk to you that way. And we think about meeting people where they are. In marketing, we have a couple business school folks here, right? So in marketing, we talk about the value proposition. My iPhone, value proposition for Apple, say hello to the future. Kind of cute, right? Say hello, get it? Yeah, say hello to the future. Evernote, do you guys use Evernote? I can't live without it. Remember everything. Slack, where work happens. Every product has this really unique value proposition. Can you articulate the value proposition of your work to the person, institution, corporation that you're trying to influence? Because if you can't, you got nothing, right? You're saying, adopt my values. I think this is important. So let me take an example from eBay. So at eBay, as I said, part of my job was managing our environmental footprint. Part of my job was thinking about my opportunity to help make a difference for the business. And so eBay was phenomenal because we got to have, it was really early big data on consumer purchasing. And so we could do A/B testing, where you got one set of people, one set of information, a different set of people, different set of information. And so when we surveyed the eBay community, they told us, hands down, if all other things are equal, price and quality and availability, we absolutely will choose an environmentally preferable product. And we're like, sweet. All we have to do is tell people which are the environmental preferably products, and they'll fly off the shelves. And then they didn't. And then they didn't at all. We saw no change whatsoever when we started labeling environmentally preferable products. And it cost a lot of money to do that across the eBay site. So what did they actually do? They actually picked products that had a value proposition that looked at how they saw the world. So one of the things we were trying to do was get people to buy more pre-owned products. because a pre-owned product doesn't take the natural resources to create a new one, and they're virtually identical to the existing, the sweater that I used to wear. All pre-owned clothes, you never know. But that actually turned out to be this mixed message. For people for whom value, like getting a good deal, was their primary value, that worked for them. So saying that this was environmentally friendly actually mattered less than the fact that it was lower price. But for people for whom they wanted to be seen as making a smart, cool, on-trend, individualistic product purchase, telling them that this sweater was just the same that you could find in, department store ABC actually was a demotivating message for them. And so what ended up happening, I wrote, this data astonished me. And I wrote all of these blog posts you could probably still find about how cool and reflective of me was way more important than green, even when 80% of the eBay community told us they'd rather buy an environmentally preferable product than not. So what does that tell me? You have to think about how people are seeing themselves in the world, right? And meet them. And this, there is no place, by the way, in which this is more true than in corporate America. Every person in a company has a role, and they see themselves as how they do that role. And if you can show them how they can be more effective, efficient, smart when they're doing that role, it doesn't matter what your end goal is, they will absolutely help buy into it. And if you don't, if you're not going to show them that, change gets very, very, very hard to make. And I think that that's true at the level of individuals for certain institutions, certainly, and the larger society. So the last point I'll make, and this is the fun point, is showing what's possible, right? So we've been curious, we've been human, we understand what people need from us in terms of value, and then we think about showing what's possible. So another thing that we know from good brain science information is that people have a very limited capacity to absorb bad information. Very limited capacity. Our brains just cannot absorb bad news over and over and over on a continuous basis. And we also know this just makes sense. Hopelessness is the enemy of action, right? If you're hopeless, you have nothing that's spurring you to make change. So if we spend too much time communicating about how bad things are, and goodness I know in the environmental sciences we have our share of information to communicate on that front, and we don't spend more time pairing it with hope and solutions and what is possible, we absolutely will lose folks. I think it would be a fun conversation, probably for a different time, to kind of dissect how climate change communication has rolled out and where we've ended up where we are. But I feel like some of this is at work there. There are other forces at work for certain, but some of this is at work there. So that actually, I'm sitting in a media organization. You guys are sitting in a science organization. Neither field thinks of itself as advocates, right? And in fact, objectivity is kind of the stock and trade that we have. So how does that look for those of us that are in the business of wanting to influence for a better world? Well, solutions and advocacy are two very, very different things, right? Surfacing solutions, surfacing what's going on, looking at how what the root causes of problems are, and then where people are overcoming those, either through collaborations or institutions. That really feels like a space where we in the environmental community could do a far, far, far better job, right? In the journalism world, there's a move towards what we call solutions journalism. And actually, I think it's a huge misnomer, because I think what a lot of people think is like you're going to get good PR for your project that you're working on. That's not what it is. It's taking all of the rigor of regular journalism, the accuracy, the impartiality, the newsworthiness, the kind of inherent skepticism and accountability, and just turning it towards looking at what's working, right? Or where people are trying. What are the systems and the root causes of things, and shining a light on them. And I think the more that the world of environmental science and environmental systems can do that, the more we can actually start building a general consensus that There are problems that need to be tackled, and there are solution sets for that. Interesting, and I hope you all think about kind of the role of science-based advocacy, which is a term that I hate. I think it's really science-based social impact, and it's just taking everything you know how to do in science and putting it to work for the betterment of people. And if you don't believe that can be done, all you have to do is look at the field of medicine, because that is what medicine has been doing for 100 years. In fact, The Lancet, which is the journal of medicine that is about 100 years old, actually has as its mission transforming society and impacting people by sharing advances in medicine. So I'm going to just end with the fact that there was a study that a lot of people in the water world got really depressed about a couple of years ago. It came out of UC Davis and Berkeley. And a couple of scientists showed basically that actually at the level of the world, we pretty much know how to tackle our water challenges. We know what to do. We're not missing the what to do. What we're missing is the will to do it. So if you manage water the way that it works in nature, at a basin level, right, at a scale in which it flows, and you do it in a holistic and integrated way, which is the way water wants to be managed, you have really great outcomes. And when you don't, you manage it the way most of the world manages water, in ways that create conflict, that totally ignore the hydrological cycle, that harm the surrounding ecosystems and people, and waste an irreplaceable natural resource. And so what is lacking in the world of water is indeed the public will to think about managing this resource in a totally different way. So to stay true to my own advice, let me not leave you on that depressing thought, because we're working on that one, and I hope you will all join us. But I want you to think of three things. I want you to think about 30 years ago, where we were in terms of smoking in the public in the United States and tobacco. Totally acceptable. It was everybody's right to smoke. Today, can you smoke on campus? Probably not, right? 30 years ago, I'm sure you could. And tobacco companies today are paying billions for public health. The biggest of the big interests was changed through litigation, through great science, but also through public will building. Organic food. 30 years ago, that was totally something that you may find in a local food co-op, maybe on the coast, right? Today, it's a $20 billion industry. Again, good science, good politics, really important public will. And finally, my favorite, which is hybrid cars or electric vehicles. You know, this was a technology that people considered dead 20 years ago, even though we knew it was possible. And then what are the fastest growing segments of cars in today's, not SUVs actually, electric vehicles. So it is totally possible to put the science, the politics, and the public will together in order to make change. And the reason I spent my morning talking to you all is because you're the ones that get to do it. Thanks.
Thank you again. That was incredible. As with each of these speakers in this series, I have the pleasure and the challenge of trying to connect all these dots and try to at least provide a couple questions to get us started in the room. It's not easy because these things are so complicated. Even though I think you did a wonderful job trying to simplify and meet us where we are, there's still a lot that went on in that. I kind of wanted to see if we could start back at one of the first things you said and see if there's a way we could connect some of the rest of your talk to this idea of the foundation. Mm-hmm. So you said originally that as a sustainability community, we maybe have done a good job of being able to identify leverage points, mm-hmm. but not such a great job at being able to build the foundation. And so I guess my question is, what are those leverage points that we did? So sort of like a leverage point is from something to something. Mm-hmm. And what is the foundation that's missing maybe to allow that to happen? Mm-hmm. I know that you spent, I mean, so from there we talked a lot about this, how we create public will, and I would assume that that foundation is a lack of some foundation to get us to public will. Is that part of this being curious or human and other things? Is that the foundation, or is there something else that needs to be there for those things to take place?
So for me, having been in the environmental community for all of this time, I would say that we've known that there are solutions, right? And people in places like this are hard at work at creating even wider portfolios of solutions. What we haven't created is the public will to put them into place and to do things differently. The sense that different is going to be better at the end of the day, in the same way that we think a smoke-free campus is better than what it was before. So I would say that I think that public will is a missing piece of the foundation. I don't know if it's all of it. I wouldn't pretend that it is, but I would say that it is a place where we have had so much investment of time and intellectual smarts in creating the solution set and in finding those leverage points that we've got kind of everything that we need to implement without the path through which it can be implemented. I think certainly thinking about better public policy has been a mainstay of the environmental advocacy, and I use that term very broadly to include all of us, the environmental advocacy community. Thinking about science-based solutions has been a mainstay. I think work on how economics and markets kind of move or don't move the way that we consume resources and interact with nature has been hugely important. But the fact of the matter is, this is something that a very small minority of us feel like is critical to be implemented.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's really amazing, because I think it's the scientific community or maybe the educational community would often think of a foundation as a knowledge base. It's like we have to know stuff first.
Yeah.
And then we have to leverage that knowledge.
That's interesting.
And I think what's interesting and what you bring to this is that maybe that foundation is more about will and some of the precursors to will that then you apply knowledge to, which I don't know what to make of that, but it's fascinating.
I think that is the essential question for all of us, right? Like, yes, we couldn't do anything without the knowledge, right? But and I'm not saying we'll ever have enough knowledge, and the quest for knowledge is always incredibly important. But if we can't figure out how that knowledge contributes to will, it's going to sit unused, which I think is probably the most frustrating thing for researchers, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally. No, it's amazing. So if we put that sort of will into the corporate context, because there's a lot of people in the room that are thinking about this corporate context, I put a silly little thought piece together for GreenBiz, and I've been making some students read it, so maybe some people have seen it. I got to make somebody read it, right? Whoever possible.
I think I saw it too.
I don't know. It's not that big of a deal. But the issue is that a lot of times we tell these good news stories through the corporate sustainability lens. We tell it through the reporting. We even tell it through the surveys that external groups do about the reporting of sustainability in this. And one of the things that I think sort of started that process for me of trying to figure out, like, why aren't we doing anything? These surveys are saying that very small percentages of organizations think that any kind of walking the walk or walking the talk is like a major part of their leadership in sustainability. It's a lot about process. It's a lot about connecting what we're doing to our values as opposed to what we would do differently in terms of our sustainability performance. And so I guess I'm wondering, where does that sort of will translate to some big levers of huge amounts of investments and spending and other things that we typically will look to the private sector for solutions? They're supposed to be innovative. They are good at spending money. They're good at figuring out what can make more money. Where is it that this sort of being human or being curious or, I mean, I can see the value piece, but where does that fit to this being objective of finding dollars and finding profits?
So I'm going to challenge your question a little bit. It is my firm belief that society, including the private sector, especially, finds money for what it finds to be important, right? And so it's the exact same thing we go back to. Is this what we've decided at a level of a business, at the level of its consumers, its customers, its partners, its value chain, that that's what's important? Because when that takes place, everything else flows, including the money. And I think that we have wanted to short circuit. I don't actually get it, right? I don't actually get why we short circuit the work that it takes, because it's actually not that hard, I don't think. I mean, compared to a lot of the other things that we work on, why we short circuit the willingness to build the case for the will to do what needs to be done. And that is about showing possibility. It's about showing that's my fourth point, show what's possible. And it's about showing the different business opportunities, showing where innovation leads to something different. People don't like to walk into the unknown anywhere, and there's certainly no reward system for that in corporate America, just like there's not in our personal lives. Right?
Yeah. No, that's super, super interesting. So if we were thinking about trying to figure out what's possible and what we can do, I feel like scientists, we always try to figure out what's new and important to know, and therefore it makes things ever more complex every time we come up with something new. And especially if we think about water, it's crazy complex because water happens to everybody, but happens to everybody at different scales. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's about my water coming out of my faucet. Sometimes it's the water coming out of my faucet that's connected to my food, or sometimes it's the food or the water embedded in my food that I eat, or the energy that I consume. All of these things that are all varying across scales, whether it's geographical scales or time scales, whatever it might be. And as scientists, we keep like adding more and more and more complexity to this. When you're thinking about your audience, it seemed like there was even some contradictory kinds of things that came out of the surveys.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's like 15% of Minnesotans think that there's a water problem.
That makes it a good survey, right? Like,
I know.
Okay.
I know. But 15% of Minnesotans think that water's a problem. 85% of a national survey say that they're concerned about pollution. Yep. And my guess is that the Minnesotans are equating water to access, because we got land of 10,000 lakes, whereas in other parts of the world, or the U.S., or whoever the population was in the survey, has different stresses. Yeah. How do you think about this sort of issue of scale with audience? These have got to be tailored things that you do about curiosity and human and valuable. How do you make that transition to match the information or the aspects of the problem to the aspects of the message?
So I'm going to be totally contradictory, right? I think you have to be.
Dang it, I asked such bad questions today.
No, these are really good. So I think I'm going to. I'm going to contradict myself. I'm going to contradict myself by saying it is both boiling it down to the most fundamental and then tailoring. So at its most fundamental, the fabulous thing about water, and the reason that I love it, is it exists in nature in a way that it's going to behave, right? And science tells us how it's going to behave. Science tells us a lot about how it's going to behave. I remember Tanny Eschenauer from the Department of Health saying, I'm going to get the number wrong, so don't quote me on this number, but something like, there are 80,000, and that might be 30,000, it might be 100,000, I don't know, but there are tens of thousands of pollutants that can occur in our drinking water. And to think that we're going to be able to test for each and every one of them is crazy, right? I don't care how much water technology you've got, that's never going to be cost effective. But if you think about it upstream of how water is flowing and working, we can make sure that none of those 10,000, 80,000, 100,000, whatever they are, pollutants get into our drinking water by managing upstream. And so that is the generic, right? And that is something that I can take to anyone and understand, like, all we have to do is keep the stuff from getting in the water in the first place. Now, scientists will tell me that's super complicated, right? But it's a pretty easy message. Keep it clean to begin with. It's easier to keep it clean than it is to clean it up. So there's the generic. And then, yes, you're right, on the tailoring, we are really struggling, even in Minnesota, to help different businesses think about how they relate to water and where their dependency points are and what the value is for them. And that's in part because it's a resource that is priced probably not related to its actual value. And it's also a resource that in Minnesota we feel like we have in such abundance. And so, that really is hand-to-hand combat. Sorry for the war analogy, but that is, specific at an individual level. And even at an individual within a corporation level, because if you're in sourcing, your connection to water and your dependency on water is very different than if you're in facilities, right? One is about the water in the blue jeans in your store. The other is in the water that's on your parking lot draining off into the creek. And you know what? Science tells us the case for each one of those people. We just have to have the patience to be able to apply it and recognize that when we apply it, again, it takes on a life of its own, and we get the scale of whatever entities we're working with to actually make change.
Well, since I haven't done a great job with questions, I think we better stop it there.
You've done a great job
I'm
with questions.
teasing. But hopefully we can open it up and spend the remaining time that we have with some questions from the audience.
If you have a question, we'll get it on the mic, so let me know.
I'm interested in the connection to media and public radio in particular around engagement. I heard another program on some work on engagement happening with Elizabeth Dunbar at public radio. And your presentation on the water main is making me think of some of what she's doing, kind of trying to build community with farmers. And you might know more. But I'm just interested more broadly in journalism and engagement and how your work fits.
Sure. So Elizabeth Dunbar, who is an environment reporter with NPR News, has had an ongoing project called Feeding the Future. And the basic concept of it, which I think is very cool, was to take two groups of people that have different worldviews, that see themselves differently in their communities. One is farmers in Minnesota. I think she limited it to Minnesota. And the other is foodies, so people who are really interested in kind of the art and science of food, and put them together, and she put them in a closed Facebook group and then spent quite a lot of time curating conversation to see where we found connection. And this is built on a model that I think is happening in journalism across the board. I think that journalism and media for sure is an industry undergoing a tremendous amount of change. It's really interesting to sit within an industry that is kind of feeling pressure from all sides. But one thing that I really welcome, but I think will take media some time to catch up with, is this idea that it's not what we think people want to know or need to know that matters. It's what people actually do want to know, and where their own, number one, where their own curiosity is, and that's where you actually start to get that engagement. And so that is kind of the founding principle of the water main. So our work on water is starting with where people are. But it is also engagement journalism is going on across public media organizations all over the place. And it will be interesting to see how organizations that require, that are not public media kind of adapt to that or not. I think it's going to drive a big distinction, frankly. I think we have a business model that allows for it that others may not.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question is, I'm wondering if you could possibly compare your Pentair experience simply with your eBay experience and share, kind of related to what were the drivers of each organization for investing in the sustainability or the green labeling or the work that you were supporting.
Yeah. So two commonalities and a difference. The commonalities were the why. So again, the value proposition in both organizations was about meeting customer expectations or desires, and increasing sales. Period, right? And that's okay. It has to be okay to say that, right? This was about good business. So in the case of Pentair, it was because Pentair was able to make more environmentally preferable products. How do we actually get more folks using those environmentally preferable products? So like water treatment technologies, that's good for the world. I felt great about that. With eBay, it was how do we sell more pre-owned goods and have eBay be the place that people want to do that rather than another small e-commerce company that we were head-to-head with at the time. So customers really mattered. Employees really mattered, and in fact, employees was our entry point in both cases, which I think gets forgotten a lot, but that's actually a constituency that businesses are thinking about quite a lot. In the case of eBay, a fun story was that 15,000 employees, people had self-organized into a green team. There was no environment leader before at the corporate level before I joined, and so they had self-organized to try to get things done. At Pentair, we saw something very similar. Pentair employees across manufacturing organizations across the Midwest and beyond, again, had self-organized to do things. So people wanted to use their businesses as a way to advance the way they saw themselves in the world, the way that it was important, what was important to them, and to use the scale of their businesses. So those were the commonalities. The difference, sustainability in general felt a lot easier in a B2B organization than in a B2C organization. And in fact, eBay was kind of the original C2C organization since it's peers selling to peers. So it's not that it was harder to get sustainability decisions made, but in terms of the relative importance of how much this was going to be a business driver, it was so much easier in Pentair, which was a B2B organization. There was a little bit of a time difference there too, so there may be a little bit of that, but actually, older school manufacturing company versus tech company, you think it would have been easier in the tech world, but it wasn't. It wasn't at all.
It's just a quick follow-up. If do you see anything changing within those business environments from where we find these sort of triple wins or triple bottom lines, and where the opportunity is the driver, at least a visible, immediate opportunity, as opposed to maybe a shift where you're trying to create solutions that have a smaller cost than other solutions, but they're not necessarily a win immediately. So, I assume that we're going to need policy intervention at some point in there, but as we sort of leverage the strengths that companies have built in sustainability, do you see where those could be used to transition in environments where, particularly around climate and water, I think there's a challenge or a disconnect between the sort of the scale of the public problem and the opportunities available for private business gain?
Yeah. Yes, I completely agree with that. I think more and more, I do think that we see the business community recognizing that it's in its own self-interest to avoid future regulation, and that is a real, true third driver, by getting ahead of the concerns. And I think what ends up happening, and the way that businesses think, is you've got your top tier of people, of organizations that have had the bravery and the will internally to do something, and then they've actually moved the bar for the other 90% of corporate America. They've moved the bar up so that the standard of practice changes, not unlike how best practice in marketing or in accounting or human resources and recruiting changes. They've moved the bar in this corporate discipline. So I think that as long as the top, I think the strategy that folks have to kind of continue to move the leaders forward is a good strategy, right? Because it's gonna, if there's this much difference between leader and laggard, they're still gonna move the laggard. But the opportunities for the laggards are so much harder to come by because the leaders are getting competitive advantage that the laggards are not going to, and not everyone can be a leader. And so we've sort of, that strategy for change has limitations, right? That lever has limitations, and so then it will take other kind of societal systemic change in order to move the whole system.
Just had a quick follow-up on that itself. From your experience with Pentair, eBay, and now looking at it from outside the corporate sphere, to Tim's question and the earlier
I know you want me to say yes, so I'm gonna try to figure out where I think on the margins, business models are changing. I think the private sector has always been the best at seeing business opportunity, and so wherever we can take a problem and find a solution that can be monetized, and that's the important part, that can be monetized, then we've found businesses actually filling the gap and creating new business models. I think about the world of precision agriculture, right? Precision agriculture is how do we take everything we know about big data and technology in order to farm in ways that we can apply just the right amount of fertilizer at just the right amount of time in order to make sure that it stays with the plant and doesn't get washed away. And that's great for a farmer, right? Because then they don't have to pay for that nitrogen that's going into the waterways. So I think there are new business models being created and new business opportunities. We have to get the externalities baked into the system, though. And the only way the externalities get baked into the system, in my opinion, is public will bakes them in and says you have to be accountable for them, just like it did with big tobacco, right? And so that's why I come back to this is the missing piece. We can continue to say like, oh my gosh, look at this great new thing that we're going to do with big data and smart technology and smart water. Smart water, we are one of the hubs of smart water here in the Twin Cities, and we will do great things. But those folks have a hard time getting their technology bought at scale because the externalities around water pollution have not been baked into their businesses. And so it really does come back to the public will that leads to the right setting of the rules at the end of the day.
Other questions?
Probably have time for maybe one last one, and then we should probably wrap it up.
All right, I want to reference your experience in communication. So I feel like an issue we have is we tend to preach to the choir.
Oh, yeah.
And so like NPR and CNN will say, hey, global warming is a thing, and their most liberal audience goes, yeah, we know. We had Chris Lamb in here, I think it was 1 or 2 weeks ago, and he talked about how you can go to a farmer and you can say, hey, the soil's getting dry, you should cover that up, and they'll go, yeah. But if you even mention the word global warming, they won't listen to you. So my question is, how can we really get this message to an audience that doesn't want to hear the word global warming because they don't believe it's a thing, but sort of tailor it so that they do care about it?
Wow, we ended on the easy question, right? So this may get me disinvited. I've gotten to speak at IonE for years. This may be the one that just you're like, okay, I'm done with her. I would question why we have to have that message through, right? So what do we really need at the end of the day? Do we need people? Do you want to be right? Do we need people to think like us? Or do we need them to do what needs to be done to combat climate change? Do we need to reduce greenhouse gases to a level that we are not on track to reduce, right? And I actually do not care if people understand theoretically that climate change is going on as long as we do what it takes. And so to that farmer, let me parse that, right? We have whole new generations growing up. In fact, NCA did this really cool thing with a conservative and liberal millennial talking about how they were communicating with their different constituencies that is, I think, available online that you should watch for this very question. And this, millennial leader of a conservative group out of the University of Oregon, I think it was, talked about how, clean energy, green energy, really popular topics with the conservatives in his age group. We don't have to have the puritanical, we can't afford to have the puritanical passion that people have to understand the world in the same way that we understand it in order to do what's right, in order to combat what's happening, right? And I think it's totally counterintuitive. And again, this is totally a controversial statement to be making, but I think that we've got two choices when you look at what the last IPCC report said. We've got two choices in the next 20 years. We can either spend all of our time arguing with people about whether they believe science or not, or we can actually start putting into place all of the solutions that we know it's going to take in order to reduce greenhouse gas levels to the level that it doesn't catastrophically change every single human being's life on Earth. And I vote for the second.
And I think that's a great way to actually end it, because it allows us to even connect to the sort of main points of, I think, your message today, which is if we don't do those, then we haven't connected, we haven't found a way to be human, we haven't found a way to identify what's valuable for people in order to make a change, and at least make a change within the realm of what is potentially possible. So with that,
Yes.
thank you so much
Thanks,
for your
guys.
time being here, and
It's
thank
fun.
you all for your attention. We will be here and hanging out for a while longer. There's coffee and cookies. Please make sure that you stop by and say hello to Amy before you take a chance to leave.